They expected chains, darkness, and silence. For every German and Japanese soldier who surrendered in World War II, the image of captivity was one of fear, a place where voices were silenced and hope was starved out. Yet what they found inside American prison camps was something almost unthinkable. Instead of being stripped of their humanity, they were handed pen and paper. Guards did not forbid it, they encouraged it. Write to your family. Tell them you are alive. For men who believed they would vanish forever behind barbed wire, this was more shocking than any weapon of war. Each letter sent home became a thread connecting them back to life, back to a world they thought they had lost. In a war defined by brutality, the simple act of writing became the most powerful revelation of all. World War II was a conflict that devoured nations and swallowed millions of men into its fire. Soldiers went into battle believing that if captured, their fate would be sealed with cruelty. The stories they carried from propaganda warned of starvation, torture, and silence behind barbed wire. For German and Japanese troops, surrender meant vanishing into the abyss, cut off forever from the families they left behind. Yet when thousands of these men found themselves in American hands, they were met with a revelation that shattered everything they believed. In American POW camps, men were not silenced. They were told to write home, to let their wives, children, and parents know that they were alive. For many, the first time they dipped a pen into ink inside a prison camp, their hands shook more than they ever had in combat. Letters carried across oceans became a lifeline, proof that even in war, humanity had not been abandoned. The shock of such freedom spread through every word written, every envelope sealed, and every family who opened a letter expecting tragedy but found relief instead. For soldiers marching into the jaws of war, the word captivity was as terrifying as death itself. To be captured was to be erased. German propaganda had hammered this into the minds of its soldiers, that American camps were places of starvation, humiliation, and endless punishment. Japanese troops were taught something even harsher, that surrender itself was dishonor, a stain so permanent that their families would rather believe them dead than alive in enemy hands. With such beliefs etched into their souls, men who found themselves disarmed, surrounded, and taken prisoner braced for the worst. They expected iron chains, locked cells, and the slow fading of life in silence. But the reality inside American camps was not a reflection of the nightmares they carried. Instead of chains, they saw fences. Instead of endless hunger, they were given meals that mirrored, and sometimes exceeded, what many civilians back home were eating. Instead of the suffocating silence they had prepared for, they were greeted with something they could hardly process: permission to write letters. The very act of being handed a pen felt surreal. For a German soldier raised in a system where even thoughts were monitored, the idea of freely writing to his mother or wife seemed like a trick. Surely the Americans were mocking them, surely the letters would never leave the camp. Yet when the first envelopes were sealed, stamped with Red Cross approval, and weeks later replies came back across the ocean, the shock turned into disbelief, and disbelief into wonder. Letters were not a privilege reserved for the elite or for those who cooperated with guards. They were offered to every prisoner. The practice was rooted in international law, but to the men who had been fed lies about American cruelty, it felt like a miracle. Each letter became a breath of freedom in a place where they had expected suffocation. Imagine a young German infantryman, just 19 years old, who had been torn from the Eastern Front and thrown into the chaos of Normandy. Captured, bruised, and convinced he would vanish forever, he was given a form and told, "Write to your family. They need to know you live." His hands trembled as he wrote the words, "I am alive. I am safe. Do not fear." For his mother, who had already dressed in black, believing her son lost, that letter was not paper, it was resurrection. The same shock rippled through Japanese prisoners. For them, the idea of sending a letter was almost more overwhelming than capture itself. They had been told they were already dead in the eyes of their homeland. Yet now they held ink and paper, bridging a distance that seemed impossible. Many feared their families would reject them, ashamed of their surrender. But when responses came, Cautious, emotional, often filled with relief, the POWs realized that even dishonor could not sever the bond of blood. The gap between expectation and reality was staggering. Men who thought they would never again hear the voices of home now awaited the mail with pounding hearts. Each delivery of letters into the camp turned the prison yard into a place of fragile hope. Some cried openly, some read their letters aloud, and others tucked them carefully into their uniforms as though the words themselves were armor against despair. For the first time, prisoners began to see their captors not as faceless enemies but as men who upheld rules, who valued the thin line of humanity that war so easily erased. The contrast was so sharp that it shook the very foundation of what these POWs had been told to believe. The Americans had not destroyed their voices, they had given them back. Life inside an American POW camp was not the nightmare so many prisoners had imagined on the day of their capture. To their astonishment, the days were structured, meals were regular, and the rules were far less cruel than the images painted by Axis propaganda. While the camps were surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, inside them, the atmosphere was often closer to a strange form of community than to a dungeon. Meals became one of the first shocks of daily life. Many German prisoners would later recall that the food they received in American camps was better than what their own families were eating back in Germany. While rationing pinched the civilian population across Europe, POWs in the United States were often served bread, meat, potatoes, and even occasional desserts. For men who had prepared themselves for starvation, each tray of food felt surreal. Some even joked that capture had saved them from hunger. Beyond food, there was work. American authorities often assigned POWs to labor projects, ranging from farming to repairing roads. For many, this work was not forced drudgery but an outlet to escape the monotony of camp life. Farmers in rural America came to rely on German and Italian POWs to help with harvests, and in some cases, friendships developed between prisoners and civilians. These small human connections, while forbidden to grow too close, planted seeds of respect and curiosity. Prisoners who had been told that Americans were monsters now saw them as ordinary people, shaking hands after a day's work or sharing a cigarette in the fields. But the heart of camp life, the thing that set the American experience apart, remained the freedom to write. Letters were distributed and collected with regularity, often once a week. Prisoners lined up eagerly, the noise of anticipation filling the yard as names were called out. Some men received thick stacks of letters, others only a single page, but each one carried the same weight, proof that life outside the wire had not forgotten them. These letters became the center of camp existence. Men read and reread them until the paper began to tear at the folds. They memorized the handwriting of their wives, the scrawl of their children, the careful script of their parents. Around the bunks, whispers spread about news from home: bombing survived. Farms still standing, siblings married or gone to war. In return, the prisoners poured their own hearts into their replies. The Red Cross monitored this exchange, ensuring that the words were free of propaganda or secret codes, but the essence was never stripped away. "I am alive. I am well. I miss you," were phrases that traveled across oceans and battle lines, carrying more power than any weapon. For families in Germany and Japan, receiving these letters was like opening a window into hope. They had been told their sons or husbands were lost to cruelty. Instead, they held physical proof that America, the enemy, had allowed their loved one's voice to reach them. Daily camp routines revolved around this fragile lifeline. Work, meals, and rest all seemed to orbit around the day letters were handed out. For many prisoners, those days were the only times they felt truly human. Some men gathered together, sharing their letters aloud to ease the pain of those who received nothing. Others became quiet, folding their treasures carefully and hiding them away like sacred relics. The freedom to write and receive letters gave prisoners something war had stripped from them: identity. They were no longer nameless soldiers lost to the chaos. They were fathers, sons, husbands, brothers, men who still belonged to families waiting for them on the other side of the world. This daily reminder that they were more than just captives turned the camps into places of complex emotions. Gratitude mixed with confusion, suspicion with relief. The longer they stayed, the more difficult it became to reconcile the truth they lived with the lies they had been taught. In the end, daily life inside the camps created a paradox. The prisoners were surrounded by fences, yet in many ways, they were freer than they could have imagined. While their uniforms marked them as captives, their pens made them human. Every letter written, every envelope sealed, was not just a piece of communication. It was an act of survival. The letters that traveled between the camps and the outside world did more than bridge a distance, they reshaped the very minds of the men who wrote them. For German and Japanese prisoners, the simple act of communication carried psychological shockwaves that neither side of the war had anticipated. In the silence of the barracks, after the ink had dried, many POWs were left to wrestle with emotions that cut deeper than barbed wire ever could. One of the first changes was the collapse of propaganda. For years, Nazi Germany had painted America as brutal, inhuman, and merciless. Surrender, they claimed, would lead only to torture or death. Japan went even further, insisting that Americans were savages, incapable of honor, who would strip every shred of dignity from their captives. These images were drilled into soldiers until they believed them as unshakable truths. Yet in the camps, every letter written and received struck those myths like hammer blows on fragile glass. Instead of cruelty, there was kindness. Instead of silence, there was voice. The realization was not easy to accept. Many POWs felt a deep sense of confusion, even betrayal. If America treated them with decency, then what did it mean about their own governments, which had lied so completely? Some German prisoners described feeling a bitterness not toward their captors, but toward Berlin, the capital that had filled their minds with fear and hatred for years. The war was still raging, their homeland still fighting, yet in the safety of the camps they were beginning to question everything they had been told. For Japanese POWs, the conflict ran even deeper. The very act of surrender had already shattered their cultural code of honor. They had been taught that capture was worse than death, that their families would never accept them. Yet when letters came back, filled with trembling words of relief, they discovered that love could survive dishonor. Parents begged their sons to endure, wives wrote of waiting faithfully, and children scribbled clumsy notes of affection. The shame of surrender did not vanish, but it was softened by the undeniable truth that their families still cared. That revelation left many Japanese prisoners torn between guilt and gratitude, unable to reconcile the two. In both German and Japanese camps, another powerful emotion began to rise: admiration. It was not admiration for American weapons or armies, but for a system that allowed compassion even toward enemies. Some prisoners began to wonder how such freedom and dignity could exist in a land they had been told was savage. They compared the food, the treatment, and above all the letters, to the stories filtering back from Allied soldiers trapped in German camps, where hunger, brutality, and silence were the norm. The contrast was stark enough to gnaw at their thoughts day and night. Psychologists later noted that these experiences created long-term changes in many POWs. Some men returned home after the war determined to speak honestly about what they had seen. Their testimony often clashed with the narrative their governments tried to maintain. In Germany, returning POWs who spoke of American kindness often faced disbelief or even suspicion, as if telling the truth was an act of betrayal. In Japan, the shame of surrender kept many silent, but within their private letters and diaries, their words revealed a mixture of pain and unexpected respect. Inside the camps themselves, the psychological effects unfolded slowly, like ripples spreading across a pond. At first, there was disbelief. Then there was relief. But over time, a deeper transformation took place. The men began to rediscover a sense of humanity that war had stripped from them. They were no longer faceless soldiers defined only by uniforms and battles. Through the letters, they remembered birthdays, anniversaries, and family struggles. They were reminded that beyond the battlefield lay entire worlds of ordinary life that still waited for them. Perhaps the greatest psychological impact was the restoration of hope. Hope is a dangerous gift in war, for it can lift men up or break them entirely. In American camps, hope became a steady companion. Even if the war dragged on, even if their future remained uncertain, the letters proved they were not forgotten. That knowledge gave prisoners strength to endure, to survive the long months of captivity, and to dream of returning home alive. In the end, the pen became more powerful than the sword. Each letter written in a camp was a quiet act of resistance, not against America, but against despair. And in the hearts of the prisoners, it planted a question that would haunt them long after the war was over: if the enemy could show them such humanity, then what had their own leaders truly been fighting for? For the prisoners, the freedom to write letters felt like an act of mercy. But for the United States, it was more than kindness, it was strategy. Every decision inside a POW camp carried weight far beyond the fences and guard towers. To allow an enemy soldier to write freely to his family was not only an act of humanity, it was also a weapon in the war of perception, morale, and global image. First and foremost, America understood the importance of reputation. The eyes of the world were on the conflict, and treatment of prisoners was a test of credibility. By adhering strictly to the Geneva Conventions, and often exceeding them, the U.S. sent a message not only to its enemies but to its allies: America was a nation that valued rules, even in war. Allowing POWs to send letters was proof that they were not disappearing into silence, but were treated with a dignity absent in many Axis camps. It gave the United States the moral high ground, a powerful tool in shaping international opinion. But beyond reputation, there was a psychological calculation at work. Each letter written by a German or Japanese prisoner was a crack in the armor of enemy propaganda. Back in Berlin or Tokyo, families received words that directly contradicted the state's stories. A German mother reading that her son was fed well and allowed to write could not reconcile it with Joseph Goebbels' warnings about American cruelty. A Japanese father who received a letter from his captured son realized that the inhuman enemy allowed something his own government never would. These letters became unintentional propaganda against the regimes that had sent these men to war. The Americans also recognized that a well-treated prisoner was less likely to rebel. Letters home gave POWs a sense of connection, a reason to maintain order, and a thread of hope that prevented despair from turning into violence. Guards noticed that the days following letter deliveries were calmer, with fewer fights, fewer escape attempts, and more cooperation. A man who believes he might see his family again has more reason to follow rules than one who thinks he has already been forgotten. On a deeper level, America's motives were tied to a long-term vision. War was not only about defeating armies, it was about shaping the peace that would follow. U.S. officials understood that today's prisoners were tomorrow's citizens. A German soldier treated with decency might one day return home with a story that challenged the Nazi myth of American barbarism. A Japanese officer allowed to write to his children might go back and quietly plant seeds of doubt about his empire's propaganda. Each letter was an investment in the future, a chance to weaken the ideology that fueled the war. There was also a practical aspect. By giving POWs a platform to communicate, America gained insight into the morale of its enemies. Letters were censored, but in the process, they revealed fragments of truth, fears about shortages back home, whispers of battles lost, hints of weakening resolve. Every envelope that left a camp carried not only words of comfort, but pieces of intelligence carefully read by those who monitored them. In this way, the letter became more than a piece of paper. It was a mirror America held up to the enemy, reflecting back their own lies, their own contradictions, and their own vulnerabilities. To the POWs, it was compassion. To their families, it was relief. But to the United States, it was also a carefully sharpened blade, one that cut into the foundations of enemy morale without ever firing a shot. Thus, what seemed to prisoners as a small act of humanity was, in truth, a multi-layered weapon of war. America knew that winning battles on the front was only half the struggle. Winning hearts and minds, even those of the enemy, was just as critical. And in the quiet scratching of pens on paper, the United States found a way to fight not with bullets, but with trust, hope, and perception. Behind every letter that crossed the ocean was a story, personal, fragile, and unforgettable. For many prisoners, the experience of writing and receiving words from home became the single most powerful memory of their captivity. Decades later, when veterans spoke of the war, they often described the guns, the marches, the battles. But POWs who lived through American camps spoke of the letters. One German soldier, captured during the Battle of the Bulge, recalled the shock of his first letter home. He had been convinced his family believed him dead. His last sight of them was the smoke rising from their small village, bombed heavily as the front collapsed. In the camp, an American guard handed him a sheet of paper and told him he could write. At first, he refused, thinking it was a cruel trick. But days later, when his mother's reply arrived, trembling handwriting across the page, telling him she prayed for him every night, he broke down and wept openly in front of his comrades. For him, that single letter was more powerful than any weapon. Every envelope that left a camp carried not only words of comfort, but pieces of intelligence carefully read by those who monitored them. In this way, the letter became more than a piece of paper. It was a mirror America held up to the enemy, reflecting back their own lies, their own contradictions, and their own vulnerabilities. To the POWs, it was compassion. To their families, it was relief. But to the United States, it was also a carefully sharpened blade, one that cut into the foundations of enemy morale without ever firing a shot. Thus, what seemed to prisoners as a small act of humanity was, in truth, a multi-layered weapon of war. America knew that winning battles on the front was only half the struggle. Winning hearts and minds, even those of the enemy, was just as critical. And in the quiet scratching of pens on paper, the United States found a way to fight not with bullets, but with trust, hope, and perception. Behind every letter that crossed the ocean was a story, personal, fragile, and unforgettable. For many prisoners, the experience of writing and receiving words from home became the single most powerful memory of their captivity. Decades later, when veterans spoke of the war, they often described the guns, the marches, the battles. But POWs who lived through American camps spoke of the letters. One German soldier, captured during the Battle of the Bulge, recalled the shock of his first letter home. He had been convinced his family believed him dead. His last sight of them was the smoke rising from their small village, bombed heavily as the front collapsed. In the camp, an American guard handed him a sheet of paper and told him he could write. At first, he refused, thinking it was a cruel trick. But days later, when his mother's reply arrived, trembling handwriting across the page, telling him she prayed for him every night, he broke down and wept openly in front of his comrades. For him, that single letter was more powerful than any weapon. It had brought him back to life. Another testimony comes from a Japanese prisoner captured in the Philippines. His culture had prepared him to die, not to surrender. When he was captured, he believed his family would disown him, erasing his name forever. Yet months later, a letter arrived from his father. Instead of rejection, the words carried relief. His father wrote, "We thought you were gone. Now we know you live. Whatever shame there is, it is nothing compared to our joy that you are alive." That letter did not erase his guilt, but it gave him the strength to endure the long years in camp. The Red Cross, too, preserved records of these letters. Inspectors noted how prisoners would gather in silence when mail was distributed, the entire camp holding its breath until the names were called. Some men received nothing, families lost in the bombings, addresses gone forever, and their grief was heavy. But others received stacks of letters, each one a lifeline. Those men often shared the words aloud, letting the camp hear fragments of life beyond the wire, the laughter of a child, the endurance of a wife, the steady rhythm of farms and factories continuing despite the war. There were stories of prisoners writing home about things that stunned their families. One German POW told his parents he was drinking Coca-Cola in the camp, a beverage so exotic to them it seemed like fantasy. Another wrote that he was served ice cream, something his younger siblings in Germany had not tasted in years. These details, so ordinary in America, became symbols of the strange new world their sons inhabited. Families struggled to believe the words were true. Some even thought the letters must have been dictated by the Americans to spread lies. But when more letters arrived, with consistent details and private family memories woven into them, the truth could no longer be denied. Not all stories were happy. Some men wrote letters that never reached their destination. Lost to bombings or intercepted in the chaos of war. Others received devastating replies, news of loved ones killed, homes destroyed, or families fractured by the endless violence. These letters carried grief as heavy as any chain. Yet even then, prisoners admitted that the chance to know, to feel connected, was better than silence. Years after the war, historians interviewing former POWs found that many remembered their letters more vividly than the barbed wire itself. They remembered the smell of the paper, the trembling of their hands as they wrote, the tears staining the ink. They remembered reading their family's words by the dim light of barracks lamps, hearts pounding as if those lines of text were voices in the dark. For these men, letters were not just communication. They were proof that in a world torn apart by hatred and destruction, humanity could still slip through the cracks of war. The testimonies reveal that for many POWs, their captors' greatest act was not providing food or shelter, but giving them back their words, and with them, their connection to the people they loved. In the vast landscape of World War II, where battles raged and entire cities crumbled into dust, it might seem strange that something as small as a letter could matter so deeply. Yet for thousands of German and Japanese POWs held in American camps, the chance to write home became the most powerful moment of their captivity. It was more than ink on paper, it was life returning where death had been expected. For the prisoners, those letters were a miracle. They had braced themselves for cruelty, only to discover compassion. They had prepared to vanish into silence, only to hear their families' voices echo back across oceans. Each envelope, each word, was proof that humanity could survive even in the darkest corners of war. For America, those letters were both mercy and method. They lifted the nation's moral standing, undermined enemy propaganda, and served as a quiet form of psychological warfare. A pen, in many ways, proved more devastating to enemy morale than a bullet. By giving prisoners the right to speak to their families, the United States reshaped not just the course of captivity, but the memories these men would carry for the rest of their lives. In the end, the story of POWs writing home is not simply about war, it is about what war reveals. Weapons destroy, battles scar, and propaganda blinds. But in the stillness of a prison camp, with a pen scratching across paper, a different truth emerged, that even in conflict, mercy holds power, and that sometimes the smallest acts, a letter, a word, a message of love, can be stronger than the mightiest guns.